Esto es MLB Live Before Lock. By the way, what was that countdown? Adam, were you as confused as I was with Tyler's countdown?
I wasn't listening.
Well, there was nothing to listen to because his mic's off, but he's giving me hand signals. He starts at 5, then he goes 1 and just starts pointing. And I didn't know what that meant. Did that mean I was supposed to go? And also, I mean, we have this, we come into the chat today. People are posting in Spanish. So I'm like, hey, I have a base amount of Spanish from high school class I took, 15 years ago. I could speak some Spanish on the top of the show. So I have that in my head. I'm all excited. Like, I'm not obviously a fluent Spanish speaker, but I know a little bit of Spanish where I could intro the show in Spanish. So I have that in my head. And all of a sudden the countdown goes from 5 to 1. So Tyler, I love you, but what am I, was this on me or is this on you, Tyler? What was that? He's still muted, but all right. I'm just going to assume that he
said it's on him.
Okay. Yeah, that was, so whatever it was. But anyway, more importantly, we have a baseball show talking about the early slate. I thought it was going to be a full early slate, so we're going to be focused on that today. And then right before we start, the Yankees-Angels game, that gets postponed. Already a game that had a little bit of confusion to it because for FanDuel, I was making my lineups this morning, and I was really confused when I'm making my lineups in Fantasy Country because Shohei Ohtani is not popping up in any of my lineups as a hitter. And I'm trying to figure out what the reason for that is. I go to FanDuel, open it up, and Ohtani is listed as a pitcher, not as a hitter. But hey, listen, don't have to worry about that anymore. I wasn't sure his points were going to counter what the deal was. Luckily, FanDuel supporting yourself was very nice to reach out to me and explain the situation. But game got postponed. Totally doesn't matter. So that aside, Adam, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Felt pretty good in my summation of what FanDuel support was going to say back to you and how they were going to handle the situation. And I think that was a good way to start the day. And now I'm excited to talk about some baseball.
Yeah, and the best part about it, too, which I'd respond to you on Twitter with this, is for some reason, FanDuel, I don't even know how they did this. Like, I don't have my Twitter account listed anywhere on FanDuel, but whenever I tweet at them, they email it to me as a support ticket. And then any responses I get to that, it responds to me as if it's a response from support. So you telling me basically you were FanDuel to go fuck yourself, that just shows up in my email as if it's from FanDuel support, which, hey, I'm sure they were either not going to respond or say something similar anyway, but game's postponed. Like I said, that doesn't matter. So something else also here that's a little different, FanDuel slate versus DraftKings. So FanDuel slate was supposed to be a 4-game slate, not including the Texas-Oakland game. That game is on the DraftKings slate. So we have a 3-game slate on FanDuel, 4-game slate on DraftKings. That's going to cause a little bit more discussion and differential between the two sites than we would normally have. But that aside, I think we could dive right into these games, starting with the Seattle Mariners taking on the Toronto Blue Jays. We have Yusei Kikuchi on the mound for Seattle, Hyun Jin Ryu on the mound for Toronto. So starting with the Kikuchi side, it's obviously not the best spot in the world for him going up against the Toronto Blue Jays. But, still, if we're looking for a lower owned starting pitcher on the slate, Kikuchi's only projected for 2% ownership on DraftKings. Our top pitchers tool does have him with a 19% chance being one of the top 2 scoring pitchers on the slate. On FanDuel, where it's only a 3-game offering, also picking up almost no ownership. I think he's a viable contrarian play. I don't have the utmost confidence in him, but he's made massive strides since his first year in the big league. So given the tough matchup, are you willing to get to him in tournaments today?
In tournaments, yeah. I mean, it's a small slate. Toronto has one of the highest implied run totals on the slate, which gives you an idea of the level of risk that you're taking on with Kikuchi. But it also typically means that the Blue Jays are going to get a lot of ownership. And so on these smaller slates, I think leverage becomes even more important because you're just going to get higher raw ownership percentages on the highest owned teams and the highest owned players. Kikuchi certainly has strikeout upside. He comes into the game with a 25% strikeout percentage this season. And Toronto's aggregate ownership percentage is the second highest on the slate. So if Kikuchi does go out and have a good game, he's, you're kind of just getting rid of a quarter of the field that you're competing against. So I think it makes sense because he is someone that does get strikeouts in those lineups where you don't have Blue Jays bats. I think it does make some sense to look to Kikuchi and just kind of make your pathway to first place in a tournament a little bit easier instead of saying, basically, oh, I need the Red Sox to outscore the Blue Jays. Just take that extra step and say, I'm also going to benefit with my pitcher if the Blue Jays don't do well.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, is specifically, I like Kikuchi more on DraftKings than I do on FanDuel just because, number one, we have to roster 2 pitchers on DK. FanDuel, it's only a single pitcher site. And the other thing, too, is oddly, Kikuchi, even though it's 2 pitchers we're allowed to roster on DK, he's picking up less ownership on DraftKings than he is on FanDuel. So, just the idea that we get Kikuchi at 2% ownership on DraftKings, 8,300 a reasonable enough price tag. I look at the other pitching options, and for sure, Rodon's the number one overall guy. And I do prefer Manaea and Berrios to him. But with that said, 2% ownership, that's a number that I'm going to be overweight to in tournaments. Not a hard number to get over to. I think anywhere around 10%, that's something I'm comfortable with. I don't want to have, my lineups totally hedging on Kikuchi, because on the other side of the game, it is a very difficult Toronto Blue Jays offense. They do have one of the highest implied run totals, not just on this slate, but on the entire day. So on the other side, how apt are you to get to the Toronto Blue Jays as a stack, even though Kikuchi has been a pretty solid starting pitcher this season?
Yeah, I mean, I still like the Jays here. Their top stack percentage is in line with their ownership share. So I think that's, there's no real reason not to shy away from them for that reason. They're a very high upside team. It's a good hitter's park. Again, almost a 6 implied run total because of the favorable hitting environment. Not the strongest lineup, but still a very good lineup. No Kevin Biggio is a little disappointing, even though it would have been lefty-lefty, but you still 1 through 7 have nothing but right-handed power in this lineup for Toronto. Some pretty reasonable pricing on the guys towards like the middle of the order or the bottom, like Gurriel at 3,900, Grichuk at 4,200, kind of helps you balance out those expensive salaries on Semien and Bichette and Guerrero. So still very, very interested in Toronto. I think that Kikuchi's good, but the Jays also have a lot of right-handed power here.
Yeah, and then looking at the Toronto lineup, I guess the other thing that would be worth talking about a little bit is just some of the expensive price tags of the best hitters in the lineup. Vlad is always super expensive. Bo Bichette also really expensive. And, I think we kind of have to pay up for pitching on this slate just because the pitching is generally good. Dane Dunning is a viable, cheaper option on DraftKings, as is Hyun Jin Ryu. But still, I think that a lot of the guys we do want to target are a little bit more expensive. Rodon, Manaea, Berrios. So are there any hitters towards the end of the Blue Jays lineup that you're looking at as potential value saving options?
It's tough because you're not going to get excited about Reese McGuire in this matchup. Santiago Espinal doesn't have much power, so I don't really like him as a one-off. You can certainly use Espinal if you need him as like the 5th man in a 5-man stack to just save some money and mitigate the expense of Semien, Bichette, Guerrero. But I do think there's a pretty significant drop-off after Lourdes Gurriel in terms of, tournament winning upside. It's pretty unlikely that you're getting, a home run and a double from Santiago Espinal or Reese McGuire, whereas 1 through 7, you wouldn't be surprised at all if these guys throw up 20 to 30 fantasy points.
Yeah, that's always something I struggle a little bit with Blue Jays stacks this season, where it's like, hey, they have a really top loaded middle of the order, but those guys are also always so expensive that it's hard to fit all of them into lineups. So actually, as a result, I've rostered a ton of Reese McGuire this season in tournaments, and actually, as of late, it's kind of worked out, but it's just been by necessity. I end up with a lot of stacks that have like 1 or 2 of those end of the lineup guys, just because I kind of get forced into it, because how else am I making the stack viable? On the other side, Hyun Jin Ryu is going to be starting for the Toronto Blue Jays. I view him as a very different play on FanDuel versus DraftKings, and it's just because of the pricing. So on DraftKings at 7,500, I actually think that he's overall the best SP2 option on DK. For FanDuel, though, we have Ryu priced all the way up to 9,800. So at that kind of salary, and also that he's picking up nearly 20% ownership, I'd rather roster Rodon, I'd rather roster Berrios, I'd rather roster Eovaldi, and I'd rather roster Kikuchi for just the really low ownership. So Ryu becomes a really weak play for me on FanDuel just for those reasons. So we could talk about it on both sites. First of all, on FanDuel, Adam, where he's priced at 9,800, which is, pretty much in line with all the other pitchers, but he's also pretty popular. How high of a priority would he be for you there?
On FanDuel?
Yes.
Like you said, lower priority for me on FanDuel. I think just because obviously with the one pitcher site, but also, priced up and getting some ownership. He's a good pitcher in terms of preventing runs, but he's not a high strikeout guy. He only strikes out about 20% of hitters this season. So the upside not quite as high as you get with some other arms. And, again, the ownership is there as well. So definitely not as appealing an option, like you said, on FanDuel to me as he is on DraftKings. Projected for 18% ownership, only about a 15% chance of being the top pitcher on the slate.
Yeah, and then it's also, it's a good spot against Seattle, but once again, he's kind of priced in line with Berrios, Rodon, Eovaldi. Then talking about him on DraftKings, it's a totally different story. Number one, obviously we have to roster 2 pitchers. Also, he's at a different price point, and he's in a price point that's kind of by himself also. He's 7,500. There's no other pitcher in the 7,000 range. There's not even another pitcher priced in the 6,000 range. So with that in mind, when I'm running lineups for DraftKings, I just kind of feel pushed towards a lot of Ryu. That end, I think he's actually, not like crazy ownership. I look at the price tag 7,500, favorable matchup against the Mariners, and I would think that Ryu would be a chalk pitcher on the slate. to an extent he is, but relative to this being a smaller slate, I think there's reason to think he could warrant more ownership. So I'm currently over the field on Ryu. What do you make of him on DraftKings as compared to FanDuel?
Yeah, I really like the salary there. I think that in tournaments especially, he makes a lot of sense because he's going to allow you to get some of those more expensive bats into your lineup. See, it's a good matchup against Seattle, not the most dangerous team, but also the lineup Seattle's running out is pretty favorable for Ryu. They only have 4 righties in this lineup, 5 lefties. None of the righties are even back-to-back. And if you look at his splits this year, he's only struck out 18.5% of righties, but he struck out 27% of lefties. So you're actually getting a pretty nice strikeout bump for Ryu against this lineup, I think. One spot that's interesting and that I'll have to make a decision on at some point during this show as I'm working on my cash lineup, but the Seattle bats are pretty cheap. And so in cash, I think you can make an argument to get to a few of the Seattle bats to save some money and get 2 of the top pitchers on DraftKings, but you also, I think, could make an argument to save some money, go to Ryu and get away from the Seattle bats. So not entirely sure which direction I'm going, but I think that's at least something to consider in cash.
Yeah, so for tournaments, I am underweight to the Mariners as a 5-man stack. We have them negatively leveraged on both FanDuel and DraftKings today. And like we said, pretty tough matchup against Ryu. But I agree with you from a standpoint of, a lot of those hitters. Like I have a bunch of exposure to, I'm pretty sure I have a lot of Dylan Moore. I have here, I'll just pull it up right here. So I'm getting to a lot of Dylan Moore as a one-off. Mitch Haniger is popping up as a one-off for me, Ty France. So I don't have that many 5-man stacks of them, but individual one-off plays, I agree with you. I think there's pretty good reason to get to them. And that's also something if you look at our top stacks tool, which is free today, by the way, on Awesemo, there is not all that high of a percentage relative to ownership of Seattle being the top stack. So they're picking up 15.5% ownership as a team with 11.7% odds of being the top stack on DraftKings, also negatively leveraged on FanDuel, but they also have a 26% chance of being the top value stack on DraftKings, which is by far the highest on the slate. That's almost double of what any other team has. So with that in mind, there's a whole bunch of individual hitters that definitely present value. And with that in mind, I wouldn't be surprised to see any of these guys hit, a home run or a double or something like that and land in the optimal lineup just because the price point is so cheap. So which are the individual hitters that you're looking at the most for value?
Ty France batting 4th at 3,100, I think stands out. He's someone that has power from the right side, which is what you're most interested in against Ryu because of that depressed strikeout percentage and the fact that he's allowed a 174 expected ISO to righties this year compared to 140 to lefties. So I think Ty France really stands out. You mentioned Dylan Moore. He's cheap and has some power. Haniger's not that cheap, but he's pretty clearly one of the best hitters on the team, so no issues there. But from a value standpoint, I think France really stands out. Moore stands out. Using Torrance as a punt catcher is fine, and even looking to some Kyle Seager at 3,800, doesn't have the platoon advantage, but he is someone that handles left-handed pitching perfectly fine. He's pretty cheap, third base, not the strongest position, so I can see getting to any of those guys. Especially again in cash games, they just project as good point per dollar values. It really to me sets up as a situation where in cash, I'm fine going there, but I think I want to be underweight on Seattle in tournaments and probably overweight on Ryu.
Yeah, it's the 5-man stacks. Like I said, it's negatively leveraged, but there definitely are some of those value bats that stand out. And I agree with you. Ty France, Dylan Moore, those are the 2 priorities for me. The next game we have here, the Kansas City Royals taking on the Boston Red Sox. The Red Sox are the biggest favorite of the early slate. Also a fairly high implied run total here for Boston. Overall, the run total over under set at 10 for this game. On the mound for Boston, though, Nathan Eovaldi kind of been sneaky good this year. He's actually near the top of all of baseball in wins above replacement. Eovaldi's numbers for the year, they don't really blow you away, except he's pitched a lot of innings this year. So there's already a 90 innings, 3.67 ERA, 3.62 expected ERA. The one thing with Eovaldi is I always have expected him to have more success than he's had just because his stuff looks good based on the eye test. 97.4 average fastball velocity this year. And the key with him right now, he just doesn't walk guys. So last year, 3.5% walk rate. This year, 5%. So that's something that really enables him to go deeper into games. And one of the things also that I think gives him a little bit of hidden fantasy upside that we don't normally consider from pitchers is even if he isn't the highest strikeout guy in the world, he's able to get more fantasy points just because he's able to limit walks and work deeper into games. So Nathan Eovaldi certainly isn't one of my favorite pitching options on the slate, but given that it's a small slate, he's viable mostly because of his ability to work deep into games. So where do you put Nathan Eovaldi amongst the other pitchers on the slate?
I think he looks good, especially at 8K on DraftKings. I'm not in love with that FanDuel price tag, but like you said, he does work deep in the games. The strikeout percentage isn't great. And I'm with you. He's someone that I've just always waited for him to like turn that corner and become an elite strikeout pitcher. And you haven't seen that, but only a 5% walk percentage is pretty similar to Hyun Jin Ryu. 22% strikeout percentage, a little bit higher than Ryu. The matchup against Kansas City is fine. Only a 3.9 implied run total for the Royals, actually lower than Seattle's. So I do think it's a good spot for Eovaldi. It's again, like I feel like he should strike more guys out. He added a slider this year. He's throwing 23% of the time to right-handed hitters, has a 17% swinging strike percentage on that, 22% on his curveball. Like he's getting swings and misses on his breaking stuff, has a new breaking pitch, but it's just still not translating to strikeouts. I don't really know why that is. I don't know if maybe he just doesn't, he doesn't throw enough pitches out of the strike zone, to get swings and misses. His fastball is pretty straight and, gets put in play, but it seems like he should be better. But even with what he's still been a good enough pitcher where he's only 8K on DraftKings. So I do think he's a good SP2 option.
All right. And I want to address that we had a question in the YouTube chat. Who was Alan S. asked, are there Boston weather concerns? Now, unfortunately, we get into a point of the season where, spring weather here, a lot of rain, and Yankees, Red Sox, the Yankees, Angels game, that's already been postponed. The Red Sox game, here's the current weather report. So as of now, during game time, there's only about a 10% chance of rain. And then after the game, it's expected to rain pretty much through the entire night in Boston. For now, I don't really consider it an issue. If we do get a situation where the game is delayed at the top, that would be pretty concerning for me because, like I said, it's supposed to rain for the rest of the day after that. So right now, no real concerns for me. I think they should be able to get the game in the window that's available based on me going to Google and just Googling Boston weather. But beyond that, if there is a sort of delay, that's when I get concerned. Right now, though, it's not really changing anything for me.
I'm approaching it as if the game's going to be fine. There's some concern, but not too much. And then another thing I think, and it's the same reason that I went ahead and played the game, played guys from Boston yesterday. I think this is going to be a pretty tough game to reschedule if they don't get it in. Boston needs to get out of town. It's a getaway day for them. They're going to Oakland. Kansas City's going back to Kansas City. But then there's not a lot of days throughout the rest of the season that these teams have similar off days, and it would be convenient to make this game up either. So I expect them to do what they can to get this game in.
Yeah. And I mean, listen, teams always make goofy weather decisions. We've seen this, a lot, especially as of late. And then yesterday, the weather was terrible. There was a point during yesterday's slate where I think there was like 7 games ongoing and 5 of them were in a rain delay. And then obviously the Padres Reds game, that game never ended up resuming. The other games all ended up playing. But for now, I feel good that the games that we have that have not been canceled for the early slate will ultimately end up playing. We have a super chat here from Soldope. Our guy who I would assume he has the record for super chats left. I don't know what it is, except, there should be some sort of award that he gets for this, but favorite pitcher and favorite stack for FanDuel. Everything's pretty expensive. Yes, I agree. It's all stuff we're going to be hitting on overall, but the pitcher I have the most exposure to right now is Carlos Rodon. I think that is a pretty sensible stance. There are ways to pivot off of him also, but the one I have the most exposure to is Rodon. And for FanDuel, the stack that I think warrants the most ownership right now is just updating to make sure I have all the most recent data. Boston Red Sox, who actually that's a good segue because we're going to talk about them in a second. But Boston right now on FanDuel, they do have the highest odds of being the top scoring team at 29%. And they're also going a little bit under owned at 25%. So there's only 2 teams with significantly positive leverage odds in our top stacks tool. One of them is the Boston Red Sox. The other is the Toronto Blue Jays. I feel a little bit better in the Boston side going up against Chris Bubik. So let's talk about the Boston offense. And we could circle back and talk about the Kansas City Royals offense against Eovaldi. But just because this comes from Soldope's question, I assume you feel the same as me, Adam. What do you like about the Boston Red Sox offense?
Yeah, it kind of just feels like we're repeating ourselves from like the last 3 days when we talk about Boston here. It's a good hitting environment in Fenway. They're facing a pitcher that doesn't miss a lot of bats, gives up some power. Chris Bubik is a prospect for Kansas City, but he hasn't really been very good at the major league level yet. So far this season, only an 18% strikeout percentage to righties. He's allowed a 203 expected ISO, 361 expected WOBA, sub 10% swinging strike percentage. All that looks really good for a lineup that has TK Hernandez, JD Martinez, Bogarts, Renfroe, with a ton of power from the right side. And then down towards the bottom, even you get some value with Marwin Gonzalez, Danny Santana. And then the lefties in this lineup aren't bad hitters. Alex Verdugo, Rafael Devers, both guys that maybe you see the ownership depressed a little bit on them individually, especially Devers, because people tend not to want to pay up for hitters in lefty-lefty matchups. But Devers is a very, very good hitter. And if they do get the Bubic early, they will get into the Kansas City bullpen where potentially you get the platoon advantage for Devers throughout the rest of the game. So I think it's a really good spot again for Boston. And the same thing that we've talked about on recent slates as well with individual ownership, I think will probably play out again where there's so many good bats on the Red Sox that you can go to that maybe, some of them get a lot of ownership and it drives up the aggregate team ownership, but there's still potentially guys you can look at lower ownership. Right now, we have them all just projected to get a ton, but there is a chance I think that changes. Maybe you get Devers ownership driven down a little bit. But either way, I think only a 4-game slate on DraftKings, 3-game slate on FanDuel, everyone's going to be popular to some extent. So I think it does go back to the point of using the top stack tool and saying, ideally the team I'm stacking isn't 20 to 25% owned, but I would still rather stack that team that we have projected to be under owned at 20 to 25% than go to some other team at 15% that only has a 10% chance of winning the slate.
Yeah, I'm getting an uncomfortable amount of exposure on FanDuel right now to Connor Wong because he is min price on FanDuel and he just fits into stack. So I'm going to have to manually adjust him so I don't have Connor Wong in 30% of my lineups. But either way, I do think there are guys at the end of the order that do make for good value plays, particularly on FanDuel. Connor Wong is still one of them. Marwin Gonzalez, 2 guys who are close to min price. And, I think with the fact that we want to pay up for pitching on the slate, the Red Sox offense, the best hitters, Xander Bogaerts, Rafael Devers, JD Martinez, those guys are all expensive. Taking a chance on some of these guys towards the end of the order, like Connor Wong, Marwin Gonzalez, I think that makes sense also because if any of these guys get on base, it's going to wrap around to the top of the order. They'll have a good chance to score a run. So I think that's a good way to go about saving salary. Before we talk about the Royals, one quick note here is that Lurie Garcia has been scratched from the White Sox lineup. So if you have White Sox stacks, if you have Lurie Garcia, just be aware that he is no longer playing today. So going to have to update those and take them out. The new lineup is, let's see, who's in that wasn't before?
Danny Mendick.
Okay, so Danny Mendick.
Zach Collins. I'm not sure which one wasn't in. I think Mendick wasn't in.
Yeah, one of the best names in all of sports. Danny Mendick. He's now in the lineup. So Anderson, Moncada, Abreu, Grandal, Goodwin, Vaughn, Sheets, Mendick, and Collins. That is the new White Sox lineup. So yeah, that would make sense because Mendick's starting at second base and Collins is a catcher. So that is the change. So there we go. Kansas City Royals now circling back to them. Not a team I have all that much interest in relative to the other options on the slate. It is a fairly difficult matchup against Nathan Eovaldi. Like I mentioned before, I don't like him quite as much as like Rodon as a pay up option. But at the same time, too, I'm not really dying to stack the Royals against him. So, there are some individual hitters that I think warrant exposure to. In particular, if you're looking for somebody to just save salary with, Jarrod Dyson, just because he's somebody doesn't have that much ownership, he gets on base once. He's able to, steal a base or two, and that could lead to a lot of upside for somebody who's that cheap. But other than that, there aren't any individual bats that really stand out to me. And I really just like Dyson because he's cheap and has the stolen base upside. So what do you feel about Dyson, and is there anybody else that you're looking at?
Yeah, I like the Dyson call. Guys like that tend to get overlooked because he's not at the top of the order. He doesn't hit for any power. He's not on a team with a high implied run total, but if he gets on base, he can basically get you a home run just off of like a single. So that does give you upside on, a low owned inexpensive player. But yeah, individually for Kansas City, I think it's really tough because the hitters that you would be most interested in are relatively expensive, particularly Merrifield and Perez. Eovaldi hasn't given up power to either side of the plate this year. 127 expected ISO to both lefties and righties. So while the strikeout numbers aren't great, he's doing a very, very good job of limiting power, not allowing a lot of production against him. You look at someone like Ryan O'Hearn, who's cheap, but left-handed power doesn't play up in Fenway the way that right-handed power does. You could definitely take some shots on a $3,300 Soler just because he's cheap and has massive power. But there's nothing really that I like from Kansas City.
All right. And today's show is sponsored by PrizePicks. Guys, if you've not tried out PrizePicks, just a different way to play DFS. You're going to be picking player props, more or less, whether they're going to go over, strikeout numbers, fantasy point totals. There's all different ways that you could make lineups, build different cards. The other thing also is that they have options for every sports that I've never even heard of, but Alex still plays DFS for them, all different kinds of esports. When I pulled up to the site and there was, a bunch of like guns on the screen, it's like, is this guy going to kill 18 and a half people? I was like, I don't know. But I thought it was interesting that not only was it an option, but you could parlay them with NBA props. So if you think that some 17-year-old kid from South Korea is going to kill more than 18 and a half people in a video game, and you also think that Bobby Portis is going to score like over 18 and a half points tonight, you could parlay those together over at PrizePicks. So go check that out. If you use the promo code Awesemo, you get a $100 match on your first deposit. And then something else to consider is that there is a free $1 million NBA playoffs challenge over at PrizePicks. So something else also, free contest. Go check it out. Head on over to prizepicks.com. All right. The next game that we have here on the slate, I think the most important one to talk about from a pitching perspective, certainly from a FanDuel perspective, well, from both sides' perspective, but I also think it opens up some interesting pivot options on FanDuel. The White Sox and the Twins, Jose Berrios, Carlos Rodon, two of the top pitchers on the slate. Rodon individually is going to be the chalk at pitcher. So starting with him, Adam, do you think that he warrants being in about half the field's lineups today?
Yeah, I think so, because the Twins lineup doesn't look that great. Like, you have to get around Donaldson, you have to get around Cruz. But other than that, it's not a particularly good lineup. 3.9 implied run total, certainly not anything that you're really scared of. And Rodon's been just, very good over the last year or two, but this year in particular, 36.2% strikeout percentage, walk percentage is only 7.7%, which looks really good as well. I just think that there's limited options, obviously, and while the Twins can be a tough offense to go up against, this lineup in particular doesn't scare me that much, and I think that Rodon stands out as the pretty clear top option.
Yeah, he struggled a little bit last time out, and maybe that'll give people some pause just because I think whenever anybody sees somebody struggle now post the pitcher substance crackdown, I think there's maybe a little bit of an overreaction, but still he was able to generate a lot of strikeouts last time out. He just happened to give up a couple of home runs, but the numbers for the year are still excellent. 2.06 ERA, 2.54 expected ERA, really good stuff this year. Also, he's finally healthy. So as a result, Rodon came into the league as one of the top pitching prospects, and he's had some success at times, but he's been inconsistent because of, number one, control issues. And then number two, he's hurt all the time. This is the first time we've seen him healthy in a considerable amount of time. 95.9 average fastball velocity. Never have seen him throw that hard, even when he first came up to the league as a prospect. And also the walk rate all the way down to 7.7%. So somebody we've pretty normally seen with double-digit walk rates. That all looks really good. And I think there's no argument for me. Carlos Rodon is the best overall play on the slate. He's the best pitching option. He's the most talented pitcher on the slate. So nothing I can really say that goes against Rodon other than, are you willing to stack against him potentially as a hedge?
And one other thing to add, because you mentioned, Rodon kind of struggling his last time out. I had pulled I pulled a bunch of pitcher data from before and after June 6th when they started cracking down on the sticky substances. If I got a total of 165 pitchers who have thrown like at least 25 pitches as a starter since June 6th. Of those 165 pitchers, if you sort by total change in spin rate, Carlos Rodon's 163rd out of 165. His spin rate's actually gone up, both on his fastball and overall. His called plus swinging strike percentage has gone from 31.2 to 28.9%, but that's still a very good number. So again, there's a lot of different aspects of how guys can be affected. We don't know for sure that he isn't affected, but the spin rate's been fine. It hasn't gone down at all, like I said, and so I don't. My assumption on Carlos Rodon is that he's not one of the guys that's going to take a massive hit because of the crackdown on sticky stuff. So I'm still, very willing to go back to him. Don't really have concerns there. As far as stacking against him, kind of like I had alluded to before, you can always on these smaller slates make more of a case for just going against anybody that's popular because it's baseball. Weird stuff happens. I'm not going to be excited about getting to the Twins. But again, you're talking about a 50% owned pitcher where if the Twins just happen to have a good game, like they don't even have to go nuts against Carlos Rodon. They can just get lucky, with some well-timed hits, get some runs up against him, get him out of the game, and then, hit home runs off of other guys. There's certainly a good enough team. Like you plug in Donaldson, you plug in Cruz, and then just, hope for the best from these other guys. That going against a 50% owned pitcher, I think there is merit there. But the problem is you're also going to get some ownership, about 10% aggregate ownership on Minnesota, 9.7% chance of being the top stack. I think if you are getting away from the actual good teams like Boston and Toronto, Minnesota makes a lot of sense just because at least you're getting leverage against the field.
Yeah. So they once again, at least for FanDuel, it's a 3-game slate. So I'm playing 150 lineups on FanDuel. I can't have zero exposure to the Twins for that reason, but they're still my lowest owned offense. So not something I have all that interest in. really quick, Kevin O'Toole in YouTube chat is saying that FanDuel has added the New York Yankees to Los Angeles Angels to the slate tonight. Am I mistaken? It wouldn't surprise me, but the game's canceled. It doesn't matter. I don't know what goofy things FanDuel is doing with their later slates, but the game isn't playing today.
It's like draft. I don't play FanDuel very often, but DraftKings does that sometimes where they'll just move a game to like 10:40 and then put a note not to play guys from that game. I guess for whatever reason, it's just easier on the back end. But yeah, don't play guys from that game. It's not playing at 9:40 either.
All right. And we have another super chat here from Soldope. He's asking for some prize picks from the early slate. So I have prize picks up right now, Adam. I'm going to ask you about some of the pitchers that we have for the early slate and just get your quick takes on some of these guys, or maybe not the pitchers because pitchers are not listed here right now. But anyway, so for the batters, one thing that's interesting about prize picks is they don't differentiate on quality of hitters. Every single hitter that's listed is 1.5 hits plus walks. So I look at that. It's like for the early slate, why would I ever roster Tony Kemp for more than 1.5 hits plus walks when I could get Matt Olson for over 1.5 hits plus walks? So to me, I'm going to be focusing on the offenses that I think are in the best spots, and then also the individual hitters that I think are the best guys. So starting with George Springer, over 1.5 hits plus walks. I think that is something to look at. Scrolling through some of the other hitters, there actually aren't that many props listed for the early slate. They have a lot more for the late slate, which makes it a little more difficult. If I was going to take an under on somebody, Yohan Moncada under 1.5 hits plus walks. So Adam, what do you feel about Moncada to be under 1.5 hits plus walks against Jose Berrios today?
It seems kind of like a weird pick just based on how good he is. Like you could just take Tony Kemp.
Yeah, I mean that's true. So there's like 8 players to pick from, and yeah, so Tony Kemp under 1.5 hits plus walks, that'd be fine. I go George Springer over 1.5 hits plus walks. Other than that, let's see. Scrolling through who else is available. That's kind of it for the early games. They have a lot more guys listed for the late games. Let me see.
Yeah, one thing I guess to mention with Moncada too, that when you are looking at props like that, I think it makes a lot of sense to look and realize that Jose Berrios has only walked 6% of hitters this year. So you're not getting a pitcher that's very likely to just give him, one of those.
Yeah, and then fantasy score, Mitch Haniger over 7 fantasy points, same scoring as DraftKings scoring. That's a number I don't mind. I think 7's a little low for Haniger. Same Ty France. We talked about liking him for DraftKings purposes. He has a projected fantasy score of 6. That's a number I'd like being over too. So a couple of Mariners bats. I think we could kind of correlate guys that we liked for DraftKings and FanDuel and also bring them over to PrizePicks. So same reason that I think some of those guys are values on DK being too cheap. Over 6 fantasy points for Ty France. Not a spot that I mind at all there. So one thing here now talking about Carlos Rodon versus Jose Berrios as we talk about the pitchers. This is more of a FanDuel strategy for me than DraftKings related just because the win bonus is a little more important on FanDuel. But Jose Berrios is picking up a fraction of the ownership right now, about a third of the ownership that Carlos Rodon's getting on FanDuel. For that reason, I think that in large field GPPs, Berrios is a pretty good pivot off of Rodon on FanDuel just because, hey, if the Twins end up winning, you're picking up so many points on the field. You get 6 points for the win, 4 points for the quality start bonus. So Berrios as a pivot on FanDuel for those reasons, do you think that sounds reasonable?
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point that I don't really hear people talk about. You hear people talk about like trying to predict wins when you talk about FanDuel pitching, which I think is kind of dumb because they're pretty unpredictable and it's just baked into the projections and stuff. But using that to kind of as a leverage point, I think is actually really interesting and makes a lot of sense where you're not saying, oh, I think Berrios has a good chance at a win. That makes him a better play. You're saying if Berrios picks up the win, it necessarily means that the most popular pitcher on the slate is not picking up a win. So you're actually getting some like direct negative correlation between those two and using that to your advantage. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's a little bit of like a nuanced take that I don't really think people talk about much. They tend to just say like, oh, he's likely to win or he's an underdog. He's not likely to win. But if he does win, you are just gaining points for sure on those Carlos Rodon teams.
Yeah, and I'm still getting to more Carlos Rodon overall on the slate, but Rodon's already in half the field's lineups. So, I'm about even with the field on Rodon right now. However, I'm overweight to the field on Berrios. And it's really for those reasons. It's something I changed in my lineups as soon as the Yankees-Angels game got rained out, because then you start to realize like, oh, there's really limited pitching options here. And then you start to look at the ownership and how it's reflected. And then Rodon becomes, just super popular and there just aren't other pitchers to go to. or at least the field isn't going to very many other pitchers. So that was something that really made it stand out to me as a pivot point. Just there's a lot of negative correlation, obviously, in the two pitchers going against each other because of the win bonus on FanDuel. So for that reason, I think Berrios is a pretty strong GPP play, particularly for single entry contest on FanDuel, because for single entry, like Rodon could be like 80% and Berrios could be like 10 or something like that.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, it's not like you're taking a substantially worse pitcher and just like praying that he wins. Berrios is good. He's not, he hasn't been as good this year as Rodon, but he's still getting plenty of strikeouts. There's plenty of strikeouts in the White Sox lineup. Like going through it, Zach Collins since last year, 31% strikeout percentage. Moncada's at 28%, Grandal's at 28%, Vaughn's at 26, Goodwin 26. There's still a lot of strikeouts in here. Abreu 24, Mendick 23, Tim Anderson 23. There's a lot of strikeouts. It's a dangerous lineup, but there's a lot of strikeouts for Jose Berrios to pick up.
Yeah, and like you said before, Berrios not walking all that many hitters this year, 6.4%, strikeout rate up to a career high 26.5%. So he's having a solid year. Rodon's certainly better, and if you're playing cash games, FanDuel, play Rodon in cash all day. Not even a second thought. You just plug him in and then you move on. But tournaments, I think there is a little bit of reason to get overweight to the field on Berrios. But on the other side, stacking the White Sox against Berrios, is that something that interests you at all for this slate?
Yeah, just because they are a high upside offense, along with all those strikeouts does come a lot of power. And Berrios not likely to get, he's not going to get Carlos Rodon level ownership, but you're still going to get some ownership going there. He's projected for 23.5% ownership on DraftKings. I think that, using guys like Moncada, Abreu, Goodwin, Grandal, like they give you enough power. Goodwin, Vaughn, Sheets are all cheap guys that have some power as well. So you could potentially get a pretty high upside stack and then still use, Carlos Rodon plus Sean Manaea or, something like that and be in a pretty good spot.
All right, so that wraps up the FanDuel portion. Next game on the slate is not on FanDuel. It is only on DraftKings. Also, guys, if you haven't done it yet, do us a favor. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, like the video. And if you're interested in some of the tools that Adam and I are talking about, things that I used to build my lineups, I know that Adam uses also. The ownership is invaluable for MLB DFS. If I didn't have ownership projections for MLB DFS, I don't know what I would be like. I guess I'd just be guessing and plugging random guys in because, there's nothing more important than that. That's also the MLB Top Stacks tool is free on the site. But if you want to check out everything we have, use the promo code MLB Live Before Lock. That is all capital letters. Sign up for an Awesemo Plus weekly pass. That will be 25% off if you're a new customer. Awesemo Plus Platinum. That is MLB Live Before Lock. That is the promo code, all capital letters and all one word. So last game on the slate, like we said, this is only going to apply to DraftKings, not on the FanDuel slate. So we have the Oakland A's taking on the Texas Rangers. Sean Manaea against Dane Dunning. Now, starting on the Dunning side for DraftKings, I've rostered him a lot more than the field on almost every single slate he's been on. And a lot of it's because Dane Dunning, I don't think he's a great pitcher, but I don't think he's bad either. But for whatever reason, the DraftKings pricing algorithm, every single time Dunning starts, he's like 5,000, 6,000. He never gets all that expensive. There is a little bit of strikeout upside with Dunning, 24.4% strikeout rate. His results for the year, okay. 4.63 ERA. But if you look at his underlying numbers, 4.25 expected ERA, 3.25 FIP. So for that reason, I look at his salary on DraftKings. I think he's a pretty strong SP2 option.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. The ballpark's good as well. The A's have a respectable, 4.5 implied run total, but it's supposed to be cool again in Oakland. It's a good park. The salary is pretty cheap on Dunning. And like you said, he's not a bad pitcher. He has a 24.5% strikeout percentage. That looks really good. 3.48 xFIP looks good. He's, I think, just better than his salary. So I agree, especially in tournaments. Like in cash games, you just don't need to get that cheap. I don't think you don't need to take on that much risk. But in tournaments, it does make some sense. Like it'll unlock, Toronto plus Boston stacks, for example, where you actually can use the best hitters from those teams. So I do think he makes for a good SP2 in tournaments.
Yeah, and it's really just a price point play, and that he's not that popular. So DraftKings right now, we have him projected for 12% ownership. Given that number, I'd want to get overweight to the field on 12% at 5,700 because, where else are we going? I don't want to roster Chris Bubich at 5,400, and that's the only other really cheap option. So, to me, I like Dane Dunning quite a bit here. Stacking against him with Oakland, I think that is an okay option, but they're not one of my favorite stacks on the slate just because I do think that Dane Dunning is a quality pitcher and, relative to ownership, it kind of looks like the field's already there on Oakland. So can't really outright fade anybody on such a small slate, but I don't think Oakland is a priority stack for me. How do you feel about them as a stack?
Yeah, that's how I feel as well. The same things we just said about the ballpark obviously apply to the Oakland Bats too. It's just not favorable hitting conditions. They certainly have plenty of power when you look at Chapman and Olsen in particular, but Mitch Moreland has some power. So does Laureano. So does Sean Murphy. Like they can do damage, but Dunning not a bad pitcher. I mean, he's allowed a 154 expected ISO to righties this year, 158 to lefties. He's striking out between 24 and 25% of hitters from both sides of the plate. So he's not one of these guys that you can look at and really single out like any one weakness that you can really take advantage of individually. And then, as you said as well, the ownership, is there. So you're not getting a ton of leverage either. Oakland's ownership on DraftKings actually looks a little bit low. 4% aggregate ownership, 9% chance of being the top stack. So you can make that argument, but I still don't think it's a great spot. Like the park's not favorable, the weather's not favorable, the matchup's not great.
All right. And then to wrap it up here, Sean Manaea, relative to ownership, Manaea is my least favorite pitcher on DraftKings today. He's had success this year. However, eventually we have to come underweight to the field on some guys. And Sean Manaea right now on DraftKings projects for 50% ownership, nearly even ownership with Carlos Rodon. And let me just refresh to make sure I'm looking at the most recent numbers, because that seems crazy to me. The field is rostering Manaea nearly as much as Rodon. Yeah, still the same. 49.5% projected ownership to Sean Manaea compared to 51.9% projected ownership to Rodon. I get Rodon is a little bit more expensive. He has the tougher matchup going up against the Twins. But to me, Manaea is going wildly over-owned on this slate. So 9,000, I would rather roster Berrios for half the ownership. I'd rather roster Rodon for similar ownership. I'd rather roster Ryu for less ownership and a cheaper price tag. So is there something I'm missing with Manaea, or do you understand why the field is getting to him at this high of a clip?
I understand it, but I also agree with what you're saying in tournaments. So I think Manaea, if you can get there, is the SP2 in cash. Texas is just really bad. The ballpark's favorable. But in tournaments, I do think he's going a little bit over-owned. Like when you look at the top pitchers tool, he has the second highest top two percentage on DraftKings at 34.7%, but it's not that much higher than Jose Berrios, who has like half the ownership. So like that's a natural pivot you can make. And then you can also just get out of that price range and go to guys like either Ryu, Eovaldi, Kikuchi, Dunning. One other thing to kind of back that up is while Manaea has been very good this season, he struck out 25% of hitters. He has a 3.66 xFIP. He is a pitcher where when you look at his splits between lefties and righties, he's been fine at preventing production from righties. A 151 expected ISO, 313 expected WOBA is great, but he only has a 21.9% K percentage against righties compared to 35.6% against lefties. So if you get him against a right-handed heavy lineup, you're typically looking more at he's probably going to get some weak contact. He's going to pitch well. He's going to prevent runs, but he might not rack up those DraftKings points. Whereas if you get a left-handed heavy lineup, he can go out there and mow guys down and pick up a ton of strikeouts. This Rangers lineup, while it's not very good, it has 7 right-handed hitters in it. So even if you give Manaea some sort of a bump for the fact that the Rangers lineup isn't very good and maybe he strikes out an above average percentage of these right-handed hitters, it's still not likely that he gets elite strikeout numbers here. So I think he projects very well because of the ballpark, because of the matchup, because of all of that. And it's why I do like him in cash games. But at his ownership, it's pretty easy to see how he just has a decent start, picks up like 20 to 22 DraftKings points, and someone, whether it's Berrios or Eovaldi or someone else, just outscores him at lower ownership.
All right. And then on the other side of the game, Texas Rangers. I mean, if you're playing 150 lineups, you want to make a couple stacks against Manaea just for ownership and edge reasons, because I do think that Manaea is going over-owned. That's fine. But my real lean here is just to be pretty light on the Texas Rangers and just come heavy underweight to the field on Sean Manaea, because this is a slate that relative to other slates, especially smaller slates, is pretty loaded with pitching options. So I don't think there's that much of a need on this slate to go stack up the Texas Rangers for leverage. I think that it's fine enough to just be underweight to the field on Manaea and get to guys like Carlos Rodon or Jose Berrios at a higher clip. So Texas Rangers, not an offense I really have that much ownership, that much exposure to or interest in for any reason. The only reason I think to get to them at all is just because Manaea is popular.
Yeah, I agree with you on all points. Like, I think I would rather just go to other teams. Like, I would rather leverage against if I'm just looking to leverage against a popular pitcher, I think I'd rather do it against Rodon, just because the Twins have better hitters. They're in a better, little bit better hitting environment in Chicago than the Rangers are in Oakland. It's just a really, really ugly Texas team. I think, and again, like, I just think there's a very good chance that Manaea can have a good start, but still be relatively disappointing in terms of fantasy points compared to some of these other guys. So I'd be more inclined to just, make the pivot at pitcher and probably just use offenses that are not the Rangers.
All right. So that is going to cover all the games. You guys have questions, get those in and we could answer them. We do have one in our premium Slack chat from Jets World is asking, how much did the wind blowing out in the White Sox game downgrade the pitchers and help bats? So it certainly helps them a little bit. But with that said, it's all incorporated into the betting line. So I just look at whatever the team totals are, the Vegas information, and I assume it's accurate. It's not like the books have made the line and have discounted the wind or aren't aware it exists. They know it's there. It's included in the data. So that's generally how I feel whenever there's wind. Certainly if you're at Wrigley Field, if we have a game at Wrigley Field, there's like 30-mile-per-hour winds blowing out to center, then yes, it becomes obvious to stack the Cubs. However, it also becomes obvious when the Cubs have, like an implied run total of 6 runs in a game like that. As it currently stands, I just assume that the line is accounting for it. Is that about how you usually look at these situations?
Yeah, that's how I look at it too. And the Wrigley Field example is perfect. Like everyone always, it's kind of like people just like jump, they like skip a step. They're like, oh, the wind's blowing out in Wrigley, so it's a great spot. And they ignore that the total jumps from 9 to 11.5 or something. Like Vegas is aware of the weather conditions. So, yeah, would I rather the wind be blowing in Chicago when I'm rostering Carlos Rodon? Sure. But if the wind were blowing in, you would probably have like a 3.5 implied run total for the Twins and like a 4.3 for the White Sox or something like that.
All right, guys, I'll give you a second to roll in with some questions. If you guys have questions, we'll certainly answer them. But until then, Tyler, run the Hall of Fame segment, run the thing, because I've not hosted the Hall of Fame segment yet. And let me tell you, this is what I've been looking forward to for quite some time, is to induct new members into the Awesemo Hall of Fame. Is it running on the screen? I can't hear the music.
Yes.
Yes. All right, here we go. So new inductees. I have no clue what's on the screen right now, but congratulations. Big win for somebody here it is. It's pulled up. Of course, it's blurry and it's too small, so I can't read it anyway because I have terrible eyesight. But congratulations to all our new inductees. You could collect your gold jacket, not here, but somewhere. You go to the store and buy one, and there you go. They're a new Hall of Fame member. Guys, if you would like to join the Awesemo Hall of Fame, a couple of things. First, win a bunch of money, which you should want to be doing anyway, but that'll definitely help you get into the Awesemo Hall of Fame. Also, download the Awesemo avatar, put that as your profile pick on FanDuel, DraftKings, whatever site you use. If you place in the top 3 of a contest with over 5,000 contestants, you have qualified to be in the Hall of Fame as long as you have the Awesemo avatar. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tweet at the Awesemo Hall of Fame on Twitter. That is something that will notify people that you have qualified to be inducted and receive your gold jacket. And the other thing also, even more important, is that after you have met these qualifications, you win your GPP, you tweet at the Awesemo Hall of Fame, you've got the Awesemo avatar, guess what? Then you can win a free month of Awesemo Plus Platinum. So go through all that. Definitely post the screenshot if you do it. And congratulations to all of our new winners who just came up on the screen, whose names I couldn't read. But congratulations to you. Hall of Fame speech pending for a future date. But all right. Anyway, let's see what kind of questions we have here. From Al Butt, he's asking Seager or Ty France as better play for single entry. I personally have more exposure to France today just because of the platoon matchup. So I assume is the same for you. Do you have more exposure to France?
I prefer France. I actually have Seager and not France in my DraftKings lineup, but that's just a positional thing, how it worked out. If just in general, I'd like the spot more for France than Seager.
Yeah, I have Ty France, actually somebody who I'm on at a fairly high clip. Scott Villain is asking for a FanDuel single entry. He has missed the bus by have I missed the bus by not rostering JD Martinez or Vlad Guerrero Jr.? No, I don't think there's really any slates where it's a thing where you have to roster any individual hitter. The other thing also is if you're paying up for pitching, it's pretty hard to make lineups that include both JD Martinez or Vlad Guerrero Jr. So I assume if I look at my ownership, I'm sure I have a whole bunch of lineups that don't have either of them. So that is no real issue for me. I mean, I assume it's the same for you, Adam. Is there ever a time you look at a slate other than where it's a cash game situation, you're like, oh, I need a roster this hitter?
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing in cash games. It's not a thing in tournaments because more or less, like, and it makes sense intuitively, the more uncomfortable you are not having whatever hitter in your lineup, the higher owned they're probably going to be because you're not the only person that feels that way. There's so much variance on hitters that, guys can fail pretty easily. The biggest thing is just, I think it's important not necessarily to pay attention to the names, but like if you don't have whoever you perceive as like the number one hitter on the slate, make sure you actually have upside in your lineup though. Like you obviously don't want to be just like foregoing JD Martinez and Vladimir Guerrero so you can get more Jared Dyson and whoever. You still want guys that can hit home runs, even if it's at a little bit lower likelihood than those guys.
All right, and we've got a question pertaining to the Hall of Fame here. Evan Roth is saying he won $10K last month on DK, third place. It was $100K to first. Awesome avatar and all. Never got a mention. So Evan, you have to tweet at the Awesome Hall of Fame because it's not like there's one of us that is scanning the top of the GPP leaderboards every day. But yeah, even now, go tweet at the Awesome Hall of Fame. And you'll get your recognition, but you have to tweet at us because or else we're not just gonna know. Or if you did tweet at us and it was an oversight, then that's a mistake. And DM me on Twitter, and we'll figure that out. Zach Jameson, who is asking thoughts on Ryu and Dunning together, and an important point that I didn't miss earlier is that he said that he needs to make some money in GPPs today so he could grab a copy of Mario Golf, which, hey, that is key. I'm currently in my Mario Golf foursome now. So I've got The Siege is DM me on Twitter. He's getting into my Mario Golf foursome. Then I also got Rinpak and Gene B. Kim. So, hey, Zach, if you do win a GPP today, DM me on Twitter. You can get into some of my Mario Golf games also. But
good luck with those Siege DMs. Once that guy slides in, he never leaves.
Thoughts on Ryu and Dunning together as a potential way to win some money to get Mario Golf?
It's fine. I understand that it's risky. There's a reason that they're a lot cheaper than guys like Carlos Rodon, but you're also going to get an advantage with those bats. Again, you can get those expensive Blue Jays bats, the expensive Red Sox bats, whatever you want to do. So I'm typically a proponent of pitching doesn't matter that much in tournaments. It's pretty unusual, for someone to go out there and put up a score that you have to have at pitcher. It's a lot easier to make up points at with hitters. So I think that's a fine combination. Just obviously it's risky.
Yeah, it's I don't think I have any lineups with them combined together just because it is a smaller slate and it's not that often I have to leave that much salary on the table or need to be saving that much with pitchers, and there are enough guys to pay up for. You could absolutely do it, but it's not my preference. If you're playing one lineup, I would say that you probably want to have Dunning and one of the expensive pitchers, just because I think that then you're probably just paying up for bats in every position. Maybe you're not even stacking in that case. So I don't know. It's not my preferred option, but it's not to say that you can't do it. But I think that covers all the questions we've got so far today. So guys, thank you for hanging out with us. Thank you for everything. Also, if you've not done it already, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Great help for us. Helps everything here. Go check out PrizePicks. Use the promo code Awesemo, and you get a deposit bonus on your first deposit. So with that in mind, everybody, good luck today. And Tyler, you can play the music out.